Once again, welcome to our school, CamEd Business School, Mr. Faya Hayati. This is a big pleasure, honor for me personally, to have someone like you with a lot of experience to share with our students. Here, being a business school, we try to expose our students to as many insights as possible. Mm-hmm. And today, I bear in mind that I'm not too good at economic studies with the math and all of those weird-looking signs. So let's keep it short and straight to the point. Now, my very first question, with your background, long time with the World Bank as Senior Economist, could you please give us a snapshot of what the world looks like at the moment? I mean, from a global perspective, a global context, the growth has been projected to be quite low, between 1 to 2. Mm-hmm. Or why is that? Is it a low number or is it a normal number for you?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Virak. Thank you guys for coming. It's great to be here. CamEd is the sort of pioneer in the intellectual space in Cambodia, right? I love the dynamism of the school, the students, the constantly trying different things and being a leader in Cambodia. And we'll discuss this more, but this country really needs that sort of dynamism in its youth to really help change its course, but perhaps we'll talk about that a bit later. So to your question on the economy, the world changed during COVID, and not just in the way that you think that people were dying and we locked up. The way that the economy worked has changed. And trade last year, so when we look at how much the countries were trading in the world, it was the lowest amount of trade that we've seen in terms of growth outside of a recession year for 50 years. And this is a reflection of how the relationships of countries have changed in the past 4 or 5 years. And a lot of this has to do with what economists call trade diversion or trade wars. And this is a real reason why global growth has slowed down. So before COVID, the world used to grow by around 3% every year. And now it's growing at about 2%, which is significantly lower when you think about it as a ratio. And part of it is by design. I don't know if you guys remember, like 2 years ago, there was lots of prices were rising rapidly, right? We call that inflation. And so all of the countries in the world started increasing interest rates to slow down the economy, to slow down inflation. And so now interest rates are the highest they've been in most countries for more than a decade. And so that is designed to slow down your economy. And this trade diversion I was talking about, so we literally can count how many measures a country introduces to make what I export better and to reduce what I import. And so we calculated them, right? So before sort of 2018, 2019, when the trade wars started, there was about 300 new trade restrictions introduced every year. Do you want to guess how many were introduced last year? Take a guess. 400? I like you, bold, quick guesser. I like people like you. What else? What other guesses? 600? Try 10 times more. Last year, there was 3,000 new trade measures introduced. The year before that, 3,000. A decade ago, there was only 300 a year. And this is a reflection of the world becoming more insular. They want to protect their own exports. They don't want other countries' imports. They want to rely on domestic consumption. And so that's not a good thing for growth. And it's not a good thing for a country like Cambodia, who exports almost 100% of GDP. That's how big we rely on exports. And so a lot of countries have started to suffer, and that's why we see global growth sort of slowing down into this new normal of slower growth. And it's the third year in a row that we've seen global growth slow down. This 2024 will be. And this is a bit of a concern, as I said, because things are changing. And Cambodia is a country that relies heavily on the rest of the world to grow. We need a healthy America to grow. We need a strong China to grow. Europe is now the third biggest partner, used to be second. So these countries are important for us to continue growing.
Yes, well said. So when you said 3,000 measures have been introduced, I'm just thinking which part of the world that have introduced the most measures?
Who do you think? Do you think it's developing countries or developed countries?
The later one.
It is, it's the big boys, right? It's all the big advanced economies, with a few exceptions also in China as well. But we've seen the advanced economies start to really scale up their preferences for national protection measures. And you can divide the measures into goods, services, or investment. So where have they introduced the measures? Is it to reduce the export of goods, or the import of goods, or on investment? And most of them are on goods. They're making it more difficult for people to import goods from other countries into their own.
Right, and in connection with that, Faya, if I may, of course, when we joined the WTO, right,
Yes.
back in the day, 2004 to be precise, at that time, everyone was in love with globalization, right?
Yes.
So everyone loved globalization, meaning WTO would almost admit anyone that was ready to say, I want access to you, I want access to you. So we, of course, signed a lot of free trade agreements since then. But in the last decade alone, or even longer, it's somehow something else that is happening. So it's rather than globalization per se, but it's more regionalization. Now, a lot of countries are actually trading with people around them rather than going further. Now, do you see that as a new trend as well? Or is it just something that some professors out there say is happening?
Yeah, I think all of these trends we see, right? So we've seen the excitement around globalization slow down. And as you call it, regionalization has picked up. You know, Cambodia in the past few years has signed multiple bilateral free trade agreements, increased its participation in regional blocs. And for that reason now, ASEAN is the second biggest trading partner of Cambodia. That's brand new, that just happened this quarter. Before that, it used to be Europe. US is still number one. And this is a reflection of what you said, that countries are having to find trade in specific places because the global landscape for trade has changed. And you know, the big European countries, America, they have to meet their own domestic demands, and they feel the best way to do it is to support local jobs. But you know, all international economics has taught us is that adding these sorts of taxes and restrictions limit growth overall when you do them. So it is a bit of a surprise that we've come back to this trend. And yeah, I think Cambodia has had to adapt. But you know, the downside is, for a place like Cambodia, what we export to ASEAN is mostly agriculture, right? So we've been exporting a lot of rice, cassava, cashew nuts. These aren't high value added products. So we still rely on the West, Europe, America, as a trading partner, because that's where we start to export a little bit more higher value added products. So it's not as simple as that we can just rely on ASEAN and our neighbors. We need both to grow the way that we're used to growing.
Of course, obviously, because of course we have a regional trade agreement, but don't forget that everyone tries to make the best out of everything that everyone has signed up to, right? So of course, while we are friends, but in trade terms, we're also competitors, and so be it. Now, with that global setting, annual growth, as Faya said, between 1 to 2-ish. Now, let's talk about more specifically this country that you and I love very much, Cambodia. Last time you came here, you presented a very convincing report on this one in front of us, Cambodia. Now, can you take us through quickly what do you think are the most important contributing factors that affect Cambodia growth? We've seen reports from your organization, World Bank, ADB, and other places that kindly project us to be growing at a rate of quite, 5%-ish. Some people agree, some don't. But for your perspective, is this projected growth rate very accurate? And then what are the factors, let's just mention 3, that you think are really, really affecting whether we're growing or not?
Yeah, in my business, there's a lot of people that care about forecasting. In fact, when I started after you guys, when I finished school, my first job was with the Australian Treasury in the forecasting division. So I spent several years there just doing forecasting. And at the time, I thought it was the most important thing in the world. And that's what all economists talk about, is the forecast. But I've come to learn that they're not as exciting or as important as we think they are. But let's talk about forecasts, because I still do that in my job. So yeah, the World Bank, IMF, ADB, we all say that Cambodia is going to be growing by around about 6% this year and the following years. And a lot of people have this reaction that feels a bit high. It doesn't feel like we're growing at 6%. When I look around restaurants, when I walk down the streets of Siem Reap, when I look at the empty sky rises, it doesn't feel like the economy is expanding by another 6%. And I think that's a fair comment to make. The first point is to say, we're trying to project the government's final published numbers, right? And it isn't a science. It is a bit of an art, the way this process is done. There's some methodologies, but at the end of the day, we make a lot of assumptions. So I think it's important to consider that. But let's put that part of it aside. You know, one of the reasons why we're growing is in economics and as in business, firms and economies care about the delta. The delta is the change, right? Not the levels. And so you've got to remember that the tourism sector, which is almost half this economy, not quite, but it's quite a significant amount, it's still not back to where it was before COVID, right? And so every year since COVID, we've had this almost doubling of deltas, right? So in level terms, for example, tourist arrivals are about 89% of what they were before COVID. But last year it was 50%, right? So going from 50 to 90 is almost doubling. So from a growth contribution perspective, it contributes a lot to GDP because we're growing. But it doesn't feel like it did before COVID because we're actually not quite at COVID. But the story on tourism is not that simple, because who is coming has completely changed. Before COVID, we used to have a lot more Chinese tourists and a lot more European and Western tourists. Do you know where the majority of our tourists come from now? Thailand and? Vietnam. Very good. You can come work for me. Thailand and Vietnam. So these two countries are now the majority of our tourists. And when they come, they usually cross the border, they spend a little bit of money and they go home. And so one way to proxy that is we look at how many people go to Angkor Wat. Because Angkor Wat's your most beautiful destination in Cambodia, and almost usually all tourists go and see it. So we look at how much money Angkor Wat has made. So I told you before that 89%, we are back at 89% of tourist arrivals before COVID. But at Angkor Wat, the amount of money we make from that is only 58%, right? So you can see this big difference. And the other big thing we see in tourism is before we used to have 2/3 of people come on a plane and 1/3 cross the border. Now it's reversed. Now 2/3 are coming across the border and only about 40% are coming. So the growth story here is a little bit tricky because we're still catching up to what we were doing before, and that's why the numbers are still strong. But there is a big change happening in Cambodia in the way that we grow. And I think in 1 or 2 years, when we stop getting the boost from tourism, we'll start to see it more plainly. And that really has to do with consumption. Cambodia used to grow by consuming a lot, buying cars, buying houses, buying apartments, buying food. And when we look at the measures of consumption in Cambodia, they're all way down from what they used to be. And this is reflecting this change in the way this economy is growing. And I think a lot of us are familiar with that way of growth. So when we see those things change, we're like, well, this can't be the same way, but we're shifting also to different types of growth. We're starting to rely again on export-led growth. You know, the number of people that work in factories in Cambodia is now back up higher than before COVID, right? So we have more people back in factories, but you don't see that. You don't walk into the factory, you walk into the cafes. And that sort of growth, consumption-led growth, is definitely weaker than what it used to be. So, and we can talk about this a bit more later, but I see Cambodia changing in the way it grows. And there's lots of more global trends we can talk about that basically mean we have to change. But we can talk about that more if it
Right
comes
now,
up.
before I leave to the floor, I hope you are ready with your questions. And those who sent in questions, I hope you're here. But before I give you that chance, Faya, if I can, usually the recommendations from global institutions such as yours would be, you have to change structural change. That's
Yes.
your term. Fiscal policy space. That's also your term. And some other things. But now, when you talk about fiscal policy change, can you give us one concrete example on what that is, on what that entails?
Sure. This is one of those changes I was talking about. So Cambodia used to collect about 27% of GDP in tax revenues, right? This was what the government used to collect. It's now fallen to about 21% and will fall to about 20%. That's a big difference of government revenue. And the reason that's happening is we collect taxes from those things that we've stopped doing. So we used to collect a lot from import duties, but we're not importing as much because we're not consuming as much anymore. And so fiscally, this is a concern for Cambodia because our source of revenue is lacking. And this is a country that has huge amounts of development needs, right? We can sometimes forget that reality when we live in the center of Phnom Penh, which is the richest, most successful part of Cambodia. But let me drop some heavy numbers for you. So Cambodia's poverty rate, that's how many people live under the national poverty line. How many people do you think that is? What percent of the population do you think lives under the poverty line in Cambodia? Take a guess. 10%? 15%? Very good guesses. 17.8% of the population, right? That's about 2.8 million people. Now, how much do you think is the poverty line in Cambodia? How much is where we say if you earn below per day, you are poor? $2? Did I hear $6? Feels like an auction. Do I hear 3? Do I hear 4? Yep. $3? Okay, so it's 10,900 reals. $2.70 a day. That's $2.70 to pay for food, to pay for your rent, to pay for your transport, to pay for a doctor's visit. $2.70 a day. That's not much. Now that number's come down. It used to be 26% 5 years ago, and then by 2019 we got it to 17.8%. But that's a low number. If you increase that number just by 60 cents a day, you now have 5.3 million Cambodians
Under poverty line.
under the poverty line. Where is the magic number to divide Cambodia into two? Right? So where is 1/2 of Cambodians living under? What do you think is the line for half of this country? $4.15. Half of this country lives with $4.15. So when we're talking about fiscal policy, we're talking about equipping our government with the resources to be able to serve this half of our population that only makes $4 a day. The cost of my Starbucks coffee, which Virak generously purchased for me, is what half of this country makes a day. And so it's in this context that fiscal policy becomes so important. But this is the good news on fiscal policy. Many countries in the world don't have the fiscal space to respond to the development challenges. But check this fact out. Of the top 20 fastest growing countries in the world, which Cambodia is one of them, before COVID, we are the lowest debt to GDP country. The lowest, not second, not third, the lowest. Our debt to GDP is about 35%. That's very low. Some countries are at 70, 80, some countries are at 150, 200%. So we have the fiscal space to respond. But if we don't find a way to increase our tax revenue ability, well then soon our debt will start to go up, because I really believe we have to spend a lot of money to help raise the quality of life in Cambodia so nobody has to live with the indignity that is poverty.
For 2024, our budget for 2024 puts the they would have to raise tax and non-tax revenue altogether. That would be around $6.4 billion for 2024. Now, no more numbers. I want you to feel free to ask any question to Faya. Anyone?
Including on psychology, you know, I can talk to you about.
So who have questions already ready? If not, I guess I have questions here, but I don't want to pressure you too much. If you already have here, you have your own question, raise your hand. All right, Rachana, can someone give her, so you can use this microphone, right?
And I know you have prepared questions, but you can also ask questions from what you've heard
All right, so
today
keep your questions short, straight to the point, right, Rachana?
Okay, thank you so much. So my question for you is I want to know, like Cambodia, we heavily depend on agriculture.
Yeah.
Is our main pillar for economic sector, right? So I want to know your opinion regarding, do you think Cambodia will move toward industrialization anytime soon in the future?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Do you come from a family of agriculture? Do you live in a rural context?
No, I didn't.
No, but now you do. But did you before? Does your family? Okay, so you're a non-pen person through and through. So that's rare. You know why? Cambodia is one of the most rural countries on the planet. There's only 2 countries in the world that are more rural and a higher income than us. Everybody else is less rural, and not including Pacific Island and Caribbean states. And this makes development difficult because the majority of people, we're talking 75% of this country lives in a rural context where they have to get educated, where they have to have roads. Only 10% of our rural roads are paved. And so agriculture remains an important part of our economy. A few years ago, agriculture used to be more than half of our GDP. Now it's about a third because we've had this huge urbanization where in about 5 years, 15% of this country went from rural to urban context. So now it's about 2/3 to a third live in rural areas to urban areas. And so agriculture remains a critical part of life for a big part of this population. And life in agriculture is difficult. I'm not talking just because it's hard work to be in the sun and labor, but it's a difficult context. Climate change means that we have seasons where we are not productive and cannot produce anything. We live in a world where everybody is increasing trade restrictions increasingly in a space that we are trying to operate in. And you know that the average daily income for a rural worker is 1,000 reals a day, 1,300, right? That's about 30 cents a day. The average worker in a normal job in an urban setting makes 15 times that. So there's a lot of factors that make agriculture difficult. And to be honest, we haven't really mastered the ability to become a powerhouse in agriculture. Now, we're 9th biggest exporter of rice in the world now, but the problem is we don't add much value to agriculture still. We export cashews to Vietnam, who then roast it, put it in a bag, and then sell it as Vietnamese cashews because we don't have the value add here to do it. In fact, we have amongst the world's lowest productivity in agriculture. 2 measures I looked at personally was what % of our food exports is processed, some value added to the technology. So not just digging it up and selling it, but you did something, you added value so you can sell it for a higher price. Less than 10% of our food exports is processed with some technology. And so for us, agriculture remains an area that we have to continue to develop in terms of being more productive, but at the same time, and this is sometimes controversial to say, more people exiting agriculture into other sectors is good for productivity because they create more value in just about every other sector, which means more wages for them, more formal economy for them, more benefits for them. And so agriculture is this tricky place where we're not being as productive as we need to be. It's highly susceptible to climate change and external trade pressures. And so we're very vulnerable. A large part of our population, the majority of poor are in rural context. Well, sorry, those in rural context, the majority of them are vulnerable or near poor. So this is a challenge.
First I said I'm not gonna ask you anything on agriculture.
Yeah.
But I wasn't telling you the whole truth. Okay, so now you said it perfectly. Yes, we have a lot of things, raw materials. Let's put it that way.
You need your mic.
And that's okay. They can hear me
you.
on this one. You said it that yes, a lot of our products, if we have other technology to get it processed a little bit, then we would have more value added.
Precisely.
So, what do you think is going to happen? Because this requires investment.
Yep.
And what would you say to a rich guy or rich woman? Say, yo, come on, put more money in the processing facility.
Yeah.
What is the message that you tell them, convince them that they feel like, okay, let's do this?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated area. Each product segment has its own issues. We have issues with cold logistics, which makes, so that's the ability to transport food and keep it cold. So it's really important for things like fish and fruits. So there's issues with that. But overall, I think the message in agriculture is we have to do something different, because for 50 years we've talked about modernizing agriculture and we haven't seen us move up the value chain. You know, when you look at the trade on agriculture, the last year we looked at it, 2022, I think, we had a net deficit. Half this country produces agriculture, and yet we have to import food. We had a $1.2 billion deficit on food because we can't make enough food for us to eat, even though so many of us work in agriculture. And so I think in these different sectors, we have to think about, like you said, what does it take to increase the yield? Even the seeds we use, there's some obvious ways for us to adapt in the farming technology that we do to move to more weather resilient seeds. The way that we do manufacturing. I did this study looking at how much horsepower as a proxy for electricity is used in farming. We were a fraction of what's being used in Vietnam and Thailand. So we're not modernizing our equipment in how we interact with agriculture. So of course it takes longer and less time and more time to be able to be more productive. So, you know, I think in terms of products, we need to move to slightly more complex, even if it's just raw agriculture. Even fruits is better than cassava. So yeah, I think these are the sorts of things we need to think about in this space.
Do you think government should intervene more? Because sometimes I hear from politicians, they say, you know, we're trying to be open economy. We don't want to get involved too much into how private sector evolves. But of course, as you mentioned, 3,000 measures are being put in place by the rich people, rich countries. So meaning governments over there really have heavy hands in the way things work. So would you suggest that Cambodian government should also have more intervention, right? Such as protections, subsidies, all of that?
Yeah, you know, my economics background tells me no. Agriculture is the most protected sector in the world, right? There's so many measures globally to protect everybody's agriculture sector. So it wouldn't be new. But no, I think the issue with Cambodia is on competitiveness. And putting temporary measures to protect us is masking broader competitiveness issues that we can't compete with. And I think the intervention of government, it's not just about protecting sectors, but it's also network effects, right? How do we improve the quality of roads, water provision and services in rural areas to make us more competitive? But I also think this is a double-edged sword. When you look at countries as they move up into high income, do you think their share in agriculture increases or decreases?
Good question.
It's emphatically clear in the evidence. It decreases. Agriculture becomes a less and less important part of your economy as you develop because it's not productive. It's typically not as productive as services, as industry. And so if you know this, if you know the path to middle income and high income, upper middle income and high income, invariably is a move out of agriculture, then the best investment is a good piece of education and training and skills so that the children of farmers have the choices to be able to participate in other sectors and not just have to be forced to imitate their parents' traditions. But right now, there's huge issues with the quality of education in rural areas. And so a lot of people don't have any choice but to revert back to agriculture. So I don't think the answer is to try and keep people in agriculture. I think it's to support transitions into higher productive areas for those within agriculture to work on more higher productive agriculture, but those who are, growing up to have the choice to move into other sectors.
Okay, Faya, I think we have time for a few more questions. I have here one, Bunrada, who's that? Oh, Bunrada, okay, over there, please, can you give him the mic, please?
Yes,
there you
good afternoon. My question is, how can Cambodia attract more foreign direct investment, and what industry does it want to target for more outside capital inflows?
Great question, great suit. You're looking very fly. So, attracting FDI, that means foreign direct investment. That means we want other people's money for us to be able to do stuff with here. And the reason you need other people's money is we don't have enough of our own. So Cambodia doesn't have a lot of savings. And so when you don't have savings economically, you got to get it from somewhere. And so most countries rely on what's called FDI to do it. So this is a big question, right? This is one of the big questions every country thinks about. How do we attract more of other people's money into our country to do stuff, to build stuff, to make stuff? And Cambodia has relied on a lot of FDI from one country. Any guesses which one?
Seems obvious by now.
China, right? China, our friend, has given us in the past year, the past few years, 95% of our FDI. Overall, they're about half, but in more recent years, even more. And so we rely on a lot of their FDI to do particularly a lot of construction, right? Which is good, but it's not productive, right? Building an apartment doesn't add value to your economy, like, for example, building a factory does, or building a road that makes the time to transport slower. And so FDI into Cambodia, when you ask businesses, what are they looking for? They want to know if they set up a factory here, will that factory be able to produce its widgets, which is a term in economics to mean things? Will they be able to produce their things quicker, faster, cheaper than if they went to Vietnam? And so what do you think? Do you think Cambodia is cheaper, quicker, faster, smoother, easier than Vietnam or Thailand? No, right? We are trying to bridge the gap. But let me give you some stats from the top of my head. Electricity costs twice as much here than it does in Vietnam. Electricity is a huge component of making garments, right? It can be up to 20% of the production cost. Logistics, the cost of logistics in this country is double what it is in Malaysia and Thailand. 26% of GDP is just logistics. The time it takes to get an import license here is about 30 days. If I submit a license, if I set a request for a license, it takes 30 days. That's more than triple what it takes in Vietnam and Thailand. Now let's talk about labor productivity. So that's the human side of this. In Cambodia, the labor productivity of an average person is about 7,000 PPP terms. So an average Cambodian makes about $7,000 worth of stuff in a year. If I cross the border to Vietnam, the same average human makes 3 times more stuff than the Cambodian. If I cross the border the other way to Thailand, the same person makes 35,000. So that's 5 times more than the Cambodian person. So a firm looking at Cambodia is looking at some serious challenges when it considers places like Vietnam or Thailand or our other neighboring countries. And to me, the biggest thing of all of these things I've said is on human capital. is on labor productivity. And this is a topic that's close to my heart that I feel is not spoken enough about in Cambodia. So, if we were to look at, on a scale of all the countries in the world, how does our human development rank? And human development is the biggest determinant of your human productivity. And so we're about 146th in the world. Human development is your health, your education. You know what, 149th is Syria, right? A country that's been at war for 10 years with itself. We're in that neighborhood of human development. And when you look at the reasons why, the main reasons got to do with the quality of our health, but particularly the quality of our education. And I looked at the grade 6 exam. You guys sat this exam 6 years ago. No, for you guys maybe 10 years ago. And when we looked at 2016, the number of students that received below average score, which is the polite way of saying failed, right? So what percent of grade 6 Cambodians failed the national grade 6 exam? 49%. That was in 2016. Fast forward 5 years. Do you think it's improved or gotten worse? 73% of kids failed in 2021. Now that was COVID. We know COVID made things difficult, but that shift is still going in the wrong direction. Khmer, same thing. Khmer language went from 35% failing to 49% failing. We did the PISA scores last year. This is an international set of exams done all over the world, 100 countries. Cambodia, at the bottom, right? This is for 15-year-olds. 15-year-olds in Cambodia, only 8% met the minimum proficiency in reading and 12% in maths, right? That's only 12%, and that's only of the students that did it. When we look at how many 15 to 24-year-olds in Cambodia finish high school, how many do you think it is? Half, 60%, 70%, what do you think? You've either read my report or you have an AI chip in your head. It's exactly 20%. 20% of Cambodians finish high school. You know what that number was back in 2014? 20%. It hasn't changed, right? So we're not increasing the number of our youth finishing school. And so when you only have 20% of your youth finishing school, and of that 20%, only 12% that can do maths, you now have around about 4% of 15-year-olds in Cambodia today that meet the minimum proficiency for maths. 3% for reading, 4% for science in the entire population of 15-year-olds. And so what that tells you is that the workforce is going to be filled with those level of skills for the next 50 years. So when you're talking about competitiveness and FDI, this is important. I hear so many stories from foreign investors or local existing investors saying, we don't have middle management skills. We have to train our factory workers to be able to read and write, to be able to manage the team. They have to do the training themselves because right now the school system isn't producing enough quality to be able to sustain it. But this is where it gets concerning. For the past 20, 30 years, we've been able to thrive with low skills. Because what have we been doing? We've been doing agriculture, doesn't require education of high school or university students, and low value added exports of manufacturing of garments, right? Basically, you get a shirt, it's already pretty much made, you stitch on a label, you put a plastic on it, and it's sold. You're not really doing much. But how long do you think we can be doing that as the way our business grows? Already we know there's a huge rise in mechanization, robotics. Eventually, there's going to be factories that can do that basic assembly quicker and cheaper than a Cambodian worker can. We know that globally, 2/3 of the 2,000 largest firms have committed to producing products in green zero context, which means no carbon emissions. Cambodia's grid by 2030. Cambodia's grid is nowhere near being carbon neutral. And so how will they produce that in Cambodia if they can't be on a green grid? So in maybe 4 years, 5 years time, this engine of growth of low value added manufacturing won't be there anymore, especially when we graduate from least developing country status, which is why we can export it so cheaply overseas, because we get preferential access to Europe market. So these things are changing globally. And the only way for Cambodia to adapt is if we start producing new things and things that require skills that can increase our productivity. And you can't change that overnight. You have to start building a workforce and education system today if you want to make a difference in 15 years' time.
I guess, Faya, now I feel less concerned because I didn't read the report on Cambodia, but now thanks to you, but now thanks to you, you just given me a very great snapshot. Now I guess for your time constraints too, maybe I go with one or two last questions. Particularly to the latest point that you made. Now we're graduating. By 27, right? 27 or 28, we would have graduated from the least developed country, becoming a developing country officially. Although we've been calling ourselves developing country all this time, but for your terminology, then we will start calling ourselves developing country from 2020. And with that, gone with certain trade preferences, right? So a lot of preferences will be gone now that we become a bit richer. So what, give me just simple ideas, like one or two, that you think are the most important things that we need to do, that besides upgrading skill, education, all of that which you already mentioned. Is there anything else that you have been thinking of that, okay, so this, Cambodia, you need to be ready for this because in about 5 years' time, you will be on par with your more developed neighbors and try to compete with them on a freer, more equal footing. So what must you have in the next 5 years? And to get that in the next 5 years, what must you do now, aside from skills, upgrade, all that?
Sure thing. First of all, I think that is a big point, but I've already made it. So I think skills is critical. The government of Cambodia is going to apply to extend the graduation by a couple of years. So it'll be probably about 2029 that we officially graduate from least developed countries. So we've got 5 years, as you said, before this day comes. And the one obvious place where I think Cambodia needs to pivot hard to is possibly one of the biggest global trends in the world, and that's green, right? Green is everything right now. People want green products, countries want green networks and distributions. And so how do we take advantage of this? One estimate says that already 10% of global GDP is manufacturing green things. So we've already started to do a bit of this. When this trade wars happened, the US said, we're going to limit how many things we get from China. So what did China do? Well, they moved a lot of their manufacturing to places like Vietnam and Cambodia. And so in that process, Cambodia started exporting more than $1 billion of solar panels, right? But the US is cracking down on that again, and so that might go back down a lot come July 1. But it's an example of us learning to assemble panels. Now, we didn't produce the panels, it was mostly assembly, but we started to do it. And I think this is a space we can get better at, producing green products, batteries, solar panels, fuses. But this is an easy solution. Right now, we have imports, tariffs. There's about 10% import tariffs on green inputs. That's 5 times higher than other EAP countries. So that's the first place I would reduce, right? Reduce the number of tariffs we put on importing green products. Some parts of green imports are at 37%. So I think that's an easy place to win. But the broader business environment is the other area that I think the government can do a lot on. And thankfully, this most recent government has shown a very strong commitment to want to help the private sector make life easier for them. And I think that's an important space. How do we make importing things quicker? How do we make it cheaper? To start a business in Cambodia, just to start one, it costs about 26% of GNI, right? So if G&I is about $2,000, you got to spend $500-600 to start a business. That's 6 times more than the Thai person, right? So it's unfair for a Cambodian to have to spend so much more money to start a business. So how can we make it easier and quicker for firms to start a business? Recently, the government through MISTI has cut down processing times by 30%. These are all good moves so that a foreign firm can look at Cambodia and think, okay, it's becoming quicker, it's becoming easier. Maybe I should start a manufacturing firm for solar panels. Maybe I should start making cars here. We saw Toyota expanding and a bunch of other factories now. These are the sorts of things we have to consider moving to, because like you pointed out, we won't continue to get cheap and easy access to Europe on garments. And as I pointed out, agriculture is not going to be the engine of growth for the next 30 years. In fact, it's going to be decreasing. So where are these new spaces? I think they're in manufacturing, medium value added, and the other one I didn't speak about is tourism. I think services and tourism, universities is one services, but tourism is another, where I think Cambodians are well placed to do it. You're friendly, you're intelligent, you're good at IT. Your country has adopted finance in the terms of digitization quicker than my country in Australia. I find it so much easier to operate here with QR codes and interoperability of banks than I do in my own country. And so I think you have the grounds to be a service hub like Philippines is, like Thailand is, and I think we need to pivot a bit more harder into these higher productive sectors.
On that note, I like it very much. I think now I tend to say that on AI, we are on par with everyone. It's interesting because suddenly in the last 5-10 years, now people start talking about artificial intelligence, or you could call it just augmented intelligence, because all it does is make you operate faster. So on AI, for example, no one in the world can say they are better than anyone, because it's just so new and everyone has hands in it. So I think on that particular point, you're quite right that Cambodia has a lot to offer, and with a lot of young population like we do, the prospect will be very good. Now, a very last point only on the informal economy, right? As you know, that just take a look down the street, right? So you have businesses. Now we call big businesses small, medium enterprises, but don't forget we have another one that we call micro businesses. So it's really down small, and a lot of them are informally organized. And the effect of informal economy is quite big, especially in our background. So a few words only on informal economy. What is your perspective, or what is your suggestion? Are we going to let it grow, or would you rather recommend that everyone becomes formalized?
Yeah, we did an enterprise survey, which is a survey of firms. The World Bank does it all around the world. It's the most comprehensive survey on the planet for enterprises, because it's the same questions. We did one in Cambodia in 2016, and we just did another one in 2023, which was published a few months ago. The number one constraint that firms identified in Cambodia, the number one constraint was the informal economy. They said that it's an unfair playing ground to have to compete with the informal economy because they don't have to comply with regulations, they don't pay taxes. And surprisingly, small firms complained about this the most, because I guess they compete more with the informal sector. And it is a big problem, because not everybody's playing on the same field, but it's also bad for the informal business too. They don't get access to protection, they don't get access to credit, they can't access formal government provisions. And as part of the informal policy, which the government of Cambodia just recently introduced 6 months ago, now workers can join the NSSF, which is a social security fund, to be able to get access to health insurance. And so the government's trying to move people into the formal economy. But this is really important for Cambodians, because it starts to increase the tax base, right? The more people that join the informal economy means the more people are paying taxes, even if it's a little. we need a personal income tax system here in Cambodia, not because we necessarily need more taxes, which we do, but we need to create a culture where people pay taxes and hold governments accountable for their services. But if you don't pay taxes, then you don't really care if the government is delivering services and you're not as engaged. So moving people from the informal economy protects them, gives them access to credit, and helps the government collect more taxes and produce a higher quality service. That's why you see places like Phnom Penh, which have higher formal rates, have better services, have better equipment. And so ultimately, I think this is a really important goal of the government. And again, under Excellency Ham Vandi, he is leading this initiative to help formalize the economy on behalf of the government, which I think is really important because, again, as you move to high-income country, the ratios flip. The informal economy becomes a small fraction. Right now in Cambodia, 90% of this country is in the informal economy. It's the wrong way round. So we need to find ways to bring in the informal economy into the formal sector.
Faya, I wish I could keep you here forever, but I know that we both are time constrained.